On June 23, 1972, Richard Nixon's White House taping system recorded a conversation which would eventually lead to his fall from grace. This so-called smoking gun tape captured then-President Nixon instructing his Chief of Staff, H.R. Haldeman, to use CIA Director Richard Helms to persuade the FBI to slow its investigation into the Watergate break-in. 2 weeks after this conversation was made public, Richard Nixon resigned as president. This conversation specifically, and Watergate generally, is remembered as a damning indictment of the Nixon administration's rampant criminality. The popular understanding of Watergate, perpetuated by movies such as All the President's Men, is a scandal of a uniquely criminal head of state who is eventually held to account by a free and fair press. However, repressed evidence within the smoking gun tape undermines this narrative. By repressed, I do not mean deliberately or conspiratorially, but rather unacknowledged or underappreciated in the contemporary understanding of Watergate. In this, I am attempting a deep political analysis of the inconvenient aspects of the smoking gun tape. Deep politics, in the words of Professor Peter Dale Scott, are all those political practices and arrangements, deliberate or not, which are usually repressed rather than acknowledged. In this analysis, it is more important to note that something was repressed rather than focusing on whether this repression was intentional. With this in mind, I will finally get to the part of the tape I am referencing, the whole Bay of Pigs thing. Throughout his confusing and meandering instructions to Haldeman, Nixon makes sure to emphasize a specific phrase he wants Haldeman to relay to Helms. The president believes that it is going to open the whole Bay of Pigs thing up again. Nixon made sure to put these words in Haldeman's mouth. You open that scab, there's a hell of a lot of things, and we just feel that it would be very detrimental to have this thing go any further. This involves these Cubans, Hunt, and a lot of hanky-panky that we have nothing to do with ourselves. According to Haldeman, when he relayed this message to Helms, Helms lost his temper and shot back. The Bay of Pigs hasn't got a damn thing to do with this, he said, despite the fact that, as he himself has also stated, there's nothing about the Bay of Pigs that's not in the public domain. Indeed, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion was one of the few CIA operations that was well known to the American public at the time. What then was Nixon referencing by mentioning the whole Bay of Pigs thing? To answer that question, we must first establish the history of the failed Bay of Pigs operation. The Bay of Pigs invasion was conceived by the CIA in the waning days of the Eisenhower administration, when Richard Nixon was vice president. In the wake of the 1959 Cuban Revolution and the ascension to power of Fidel Castro, the CIA planned to recruit and train anti-Castro Cuban exiles for a paramilitary invasion of the island. However, Eisenhower was not able to see the plan through. In November 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected President of the United States. With this change in the presidency came the opportunity for a change in staff at the highest levels of government. Despite suggestions from insiders that he get rid of all the holdovers from the Eisenhower administration, Kennedy retained many members of the previous administration, including General Lyman Lemnitzer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and CIA Director Allen Dulles. Kennedy's decision to hang on to the head of the agency in charge of the planning of the Bay of Pigs invasion ensured a continuation of policy from the previous administration. This set up Kennedy for battles within his own government, as he strongly disagreed with the foreign policy of Dulles and Eisenhower. In 1954, while representing the state of Massachusetts as a United States Senator, Kennedy spoke against the Eisenhower administration's support for France's attempt to regain control over its former colony, Vietnam. Kennedy detested the cruelty and pointlessness of imperialism. If we fail to meet the challenge of either Soviet or Western imperialism, then no amount of foreign aid, no aggrandizement of armaments, no new pacts or doctrines or high-level conferences can prevent further setbacks to our course and to our security. Dulles, by contrast, supported the brute expansion of American power around the world. Before his time as Director of Central Intelligence, Dulles worked as a military intelligence operative and Wall Street lawyer. He was deeply connected to the financial elite, not just in the US, but around the world. As head of the CIA, Dulles organized coups against governments which challenged the success of Western business interests, such as United Fruit Company in Guatemala and the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in Iran. The planning for the Bay of Pigs invasion continued when Kennedy assumed the presidency. E. Howard Hunt worked as the liaison between the CIA and the Cuban exile community in the United States. This was despite President Kennedy's reservations about the invasion. Though he had approved the plan, Kennedy made efforts to scale it back and wanted to minimize the United States' liability. Eager to assuage the new president, Dulles stepped in with a lie. Released meeting minutes from the CIA's Cuban Task Force from November 5, 1960, show that the agency knew its plan for an invasion would fail without the support of the Department of Defense and U.S. military. In other words, the success of the invasion depended on the United States engaging in full-fledged war with Cuba. Cognizant of Kennedy's reservations about the U.S. being implicated in the invasion, Dulles assured him that the invasion could succeed without U.S. air support. Dulles deceived and undermined the president to go along with his hidden agenda. The group of anti-Castro Cuban exiles who washed ashore the Bay of Pigs on April 17, 1961, were doomed before they disembarked. Kennedy monitored the situation and watched the disaster unfold with Dulles' allies in the Pentagon, Lyman Lemnitzer and Navy Chief Arleigh Burke. Despite Kennedy's insistence that future U.S. military involvement was not an option, Lemnitzer and Burke continued to press for further escalation. The latter had even positioned 2 battalions of Marines on Navy destroyers off the coast of Cuba, confident that Kennedy would fold under the pressure from the CIA and Pentagon. However, Kennedy held firm. We're not going to plunge into irresponsible action just because a fanatical fringe in the country puts so-called national pride above national reason, he said. The Cuban exiles were eventually rounded up and the invasion failed. Kennedy stood in front of the nation and took full responsibility. Victory has 1,000 fathers, but defeat is an orphan, he said. The fallout of the Bay of Pigs failure in the highest levels of government was devastating. Kennedy no longer accepted intelligence briefings from Dulles. Lemnitzer and Hunt strongly condemned Kennedy's actions as a deep betrayal. In November 1961, Allen Dulles was replaced as Director of Central Intelligence. Not only had the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion created enemies for Kennedy within his own government, he now had powerful enemies outside of government, including anti-Castro Cuban exiles, hawkish military elements, and Allen Dulles and his deep web of contacts. President Kennedy was shot and killed on November 2, 1963 in Dallas, Texas. A little over an hour after the shooting, Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested for the murder by Dallas police. As he was perp-walked in front of television cameras, Oswald declared himself to be a patsy. 2 days after Kennedy's assassination, Oswald himself was killed by well-connected nightclub owner and Dallas police informant Jack Ruby. Richard Nixon had perhaps a less acrimonious, but nevertheless complicated relationship with his CIA director, Richard Helms. Nixon had a window into the goings-on of the CIA during his time as vice president in the Eisenhower administration when Allen Dulles was director of Central Intelligence. As the evidence I plan to lay out in this section will demonstrate, although Nixon was less antagonistic toward the CIA than Kennedy, he still posed a threat to the agency. Richard Helms began his career in intelligence in the OSS, the wartime precursor to the CIA, where he worked under Allen Dulles. After the CIA was created, he worked in the Directorate of Plans, which specialized in clandestine operations alongside E. Howard Hunt. He would eventually go on to run the department before ascending to the Director of Central Intelligence. By 1971, Richard Helms was in charge of the CIA, E. Howard Hunt was working in the White House after being referred for the job by Helms himself, and Richard Nixon was thinking about re-election. It was likely that Nixon would have to face off against Ted Kennedy in the 1972 general election. In an attempt to put Kennedy on the defensive, Nixon tasked his counsel John Ehrlichman with tapping Richard Helms for information about the lowlights of his older brother, John Kennedy's presidency. This included the Bay of Pigs invasion. However, Helms was reluctant to give Nixon any information on the matter. When Ehrlichman returned to Nixon empty-handed, the president fumed. "Maybe we should just get rid of Helms," he said. Ehrlichman relayed that Helms was concerned about any sensitive information getting into the hands of Hunt. "Helms is scared to death of this guy Hunt we got working for us because he knows where a lot of the bodies are buried," Ehrlichman said. Having had enough of Helms' noncompliance, Nixon summoned him to the White House to show Helms that he meant business. "I know what happened in Iran. I also know what happened in Guatemala," Nixon told Helms, referring to the coups the CIA orchestrated in those countries. The CIA's involvement in both changes in leadership was not publicly known at the time, so Nixon's invocation of these events implied a threat. It was not the last threat he would make during this conversation. He pressed further. "My interest there is solely to know the facts, and, in the event things heat up, this becomes an issue," Nixon said. He was finally ready to tip his hand. Apropos of nothing, he brought up the "Who Shot John" angle. Without question, this was a reference to the Kennedy assassination. Why Nixon chose to touch the subject in conversation with the director of the CIA raises further questions. Following discussion of the CIA's most tightly guarded secrets, it points to the CIA's knowledge of, involvement in, or attempt to cover up the truth behind the Kennedy assassination. There was no going back from this point. E. Howard Hunt's job in the White House was to go after President Nixon's enemies. When Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times, which undermined the president's Vietnam War effort, Hunt was tasked with breaking into the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist. Hunt was later tasked with more black bag jobs alongside former FBI agent G. Gordon Liddy. The pair hung a sign on their office door identifying themselves as the Plumbers, allegedly because they saw their job as plugging leaks to the press. The Plumbers, along with ex-CIA officer James McCord, were recruited to break into the offices of the Democratic National Committee. According to Liddy, the order came down from the White House. They were to look for compromising information on DNC staff and wiretap the phone of Larry O'Brien, then chair of the DNC. To assist in the operation, Hunt recruited several Cuban exiles, among them a man named Frank Sturgis. More information on him will follow. This motley crew of the Plumbers and associated Cubans first broke into the Watergate offices of the DNC on May 17, 1972. However, Liddy came back not long after and reported that the group had to break in again. McCord had allegedly messed up the operation. This group returned on June 16, 1972. All involved, with the exception of Liddy and Hunt, were caught and arrested that night. As news of the Watergate break-in spread in the Washington Post, Nixon worried about any potential connection being made between the White House and the men involved in the break-in. Here we return to the whole Bay of Pigs thing. This is where Nixon instructed Haldeman to relay his coded threat to Helms. "Play it tough," he said. Again, he invoked Hunt. "This fellow Hunt, he knows too damn much, and he was involved. We happen to know that." In the context of Nixon's conversation with Helms about the "Who Shot John" angle, the whole Bay of Pigs thing can only have one meaning: the Kennedy assassination. Further corroboration of this interpretation can be found by exploring E. Howard Hunt's connection to Kennedy's murder. As mentioned previously, Hunt worked with the CIA to recruit Cuban exiles for the Bay of Pigs invasion. After the operation's failure, he became virulently anti-Kennedy. Shortly after Kennedy was shot in Dallas, 3 men were photographed by local newspaper photographers walking alongside Dallas police. Because of their disheveled appearance, they came to be known as the 3 Tramps. It has been alleged that 2 of the 3 tramps were E. Howard Hunt and future Watergate burglar Frank Sturgis. Peter Dale Scott has illuminated many of the links between Dallas and Watergate and noted that he was already investigating Sturgis in connection to Kennedy's death when contemporaneous reports about his involvement in Watergate surfaced. At the end of his life, E. Howard Hunt himself admitted to having played a role in the Kennedy assassination. In his writing on the subject, Peter Dale Scott emphasizes important connections between Dallas and Watergate. Not only do they involve some of the same people, but they can both be seen as ways of removing an incumbent president from office. Determining for what reason or at whose hand is not the task of this video. Lamentably, there were many important pieces of context I left out in order to tell this story. Those interested in exploring this subject further should look into the relationship between intelligence and organized crime, especially after the Cuban Revolution, the way both Kennedy and Nixon challenged the foreign policy establishment, and the reversal of Kennedy's Vietnam policy after his assassination. Many authors have written on these subjects, including Peter Dale Scott, David Talbot, and Jefferson Morley. I sourced most of the information in this video from their books. In making this video, I set out not to make new observations, but rather to relay these authors' observations and research in a convincing and digestible format. Above all else, the task of this video is to ask the question, why was the phrase "the whole Bay of Pigs thing" such a useful euphemism for the Kennedy assassination? Exploring both Dallas and Watergate through this lens provides a much better understanding of both events. It is a thread that produces a great deal of yarn if pulled. Fortunately for investigators, and perhaps unfortunately for this country, the history of this past century is a ragged sweater with many pieces of yarn to pull.